You feel it before you see it. A whisper that isn't sound, a color that shouldn't exist, threading through the edges of your perception like silk pulled across broken glass. It begins so gently you might mistake it for your own thoughts, your own ambitions finally taking shape after years of stifled potential. The Imperium taught you that knowledge is heresy, that questioning is weakness, that your place in the machine is fixed and eternal. But somewhere in the grinding darkness of your service, something changed. A data slate lingered too long in your hands, its contents more than requisition orders. A dream visited you 3 nights running, each time showing you the same impossible geometry, the same 9-pointed star rotating in dimensions your eyes weren't meant to perceive. You told yourself it meant nothing. You were wrong. Tzeentch doesn't announce himself with fire and proclamation like some crude god of war. He seduces with possibility, corrupts through curiosity, and by the time you realize you've been touched by the architect of fate, the transformation has already begun. Your skin remembers textures it never felt. Your mind solves equations you never learned. And behind your eyes, colors bloom that have no names in any human tongue, painting your thoughts in hues of madness and transcendence. Before we descend further into this labyrinth of change and corruption, I need you to understand something crucial. This journey into Tzeentch's embrace is not just another lore video, it's a descent into the most insidious form of damnation the galaxy has ever known. If this exploration into the nature of transformation and the horror of enlightenment speaks to you, if you want to see more deep dives into the darkest corners of Warhammer's lore, then hit that like button, share this with your fellow seekers of forbidden knowledge, and subscribe because we're only beginning to scratch the surface of what the Changer of Ways has in store for those foolish enough to listen to his whispers. You feel it before you see it. A whisper that isn't sound, a color that shouldn't exist, threading through the edges of your perception like silk pulled across broken glass. It begins so gently you might mistake it for your own thoughts, your own ambitions finally taking shape after years of stifled potential. The Imperium taught you that knowledge is heresy, that questioning is weakness, that your place in the machine is fixed and eternal. But somewhere in the grinding darkness of your service, something changed. A data slate lingered too long in your hands, its contents more than requisition orders. Technical specifications that made no sense until you looked at them sideways, formulas that seemed to breathe and shift when you weren't focusing directly on them. You should have reported it. Protocol demanded immediate notification of any anomalous materials. Instead, you read further, telling yourself you needed to understand the nature of the corruption before filing your report. That hesitation, that single moment of curiosity overriding obedience, was all Tzeentch needed. The dreams came next, arriving with the precision of scheduled maintenance but infinitely more invasive. 3 nights in succession you found yourself standing in a chamber that couldn't exist within the dimensions you understood, its walls folding through angles that made your sleeping eyes water even as they tried desperately to trace the impossible architecture. At the center of this space, suspended in nothing and everything simultaneously, rotated a star of 9 points, each tip bleeding a different color into the void around it. Blues that tasted like ambition. Purples that smelled like revelation. Golds that whispered in voices too numerous to count, each one speaking a different secret, each secret a key to doors you didn't know existed within your own mind. You woke from these dreams not exhausted but energized, filled with a clarity you'd never experienced in your decades of service to the God Emperor. Equations you'd struggled with for weeks suddenly resolved themselves with elegant simplicity. Political maneuverings within your department that had seemed chaotic now revealed patterns you could predict and exploit. The incompetent overseer who'd blocked your advancement for years made a fatal error in his reporting, an error you noticed and documented with perfect timing, and suddenly you found yourself promoted into his position, exactly as some small voice in your head had suggested you would be 3 days before it happened. Success breeds confidence, and confidence breeds hunger for more success. That's how it starts, not with horns and madness but with the intoxicating taste of potential fulfilled. You began seeking out the anomalous data slates, requisitioning materials that officially didn't exist, attending briefings on sectors where reality wore thin and strange reports filtered back from the frontier. Each piece of forbidden knowledge felt like reclaiming something that had always belonged to you, pulling back curtains the Imperium had hung to keep you blind and docile. The prayers you'd recited since childhood began to feel hollow, their words empty repetition rather than truth. You still mouthed them during mandatory devotions, but behind your lips your mind wandered through those impossible chambers from your dreams, exploring corridors that led to understanding the priests of the Mini-Storum would call damnation. But damnation is just a word the ignorant use for enlightenment they lack the capacity to comprehend. You knew that now. You'd been taught that knowledge. Your colleagues began to notice changes before you did. They commented on how you'd lost weight though you ate the same rations as always. How your eyes seemed brighter, more intense, reflecting light at angles that didn't quite match the lumens in the room. How you developed a habit of tilting your head slightly when listening, as if hearing additional conversations threading beneath the surface of their words. You dismissed their concerns with the confidence of someone who knows things others don't, someone who's seen behind the veil and found not horror but possibility. They were still trapped in the prison of imperial dogma, still believing the lie that ignorance equals safety and blind faith equals virtue. You pitied them even as you used their limitations to advance yourself further up the hierarchy. Every promotion brought access to more restricted information, more sealed archives, more data streams carrying whispers from places where the immaterium pressed close against reality's skin. You devoured it all with a hunger that never satisfied, only grew, each answer spawning 9 new questions, each question opening 9 new paths, each path branching into 9 more until your mind became a maze of inquiry that felt more like home than the cramped quarters where your body still nominally resided. The physical changes began so subtly you explained them away for weeks. A persistent itch along your spine that never quite resolved no matter how you scratched. Headaches that felt like your skull was expanding to accommodate something larger than the brain it had previously housed. Dreams where you saw yourself from outside your body, watching your sleeping form twist and reconfigure in ways that should have broken bones but instead seemed to release tension, like a chrysalis splitting to allow something new to emerge. You stopped looking in mirrors not from fear but from disinterest, the concerns of physical appearance seeming trivial compared to the vast internal landscapes you were exploring. Your flesh was just a vessel, and vessels could be reshaped to better serve their contents. Some distant part of you, the part that still remembered what it meant to be simply and wholly human, screamed warnings you no longer had interest in hearing. That part grew quieter every day, its voice drowned beneath the chorus of revelation singing through your neurons in frequencies your original biology had never been designed to process. Tzeentch doesn't announce himself. There's no moment of formal introduction, no demon appearing to offer contracts signed in blood. The corruption is so gradual, so perfectly calibrated to feel like natural evolution rather than external infection, that by the time you realize you've been changed, you can no longer remember what you were changing from. Was there ever a version of you that found comfort in ignorance, that believed the Emperor's light was sufficient illumination for all existence? It seems impossible now, a childhood fantasy as irrelevant as believing in fairy tales. You are becoming something more, something better, and if the process requires shedding outdated concepts like loyalty and sanity and the sanctity of your original form, well, those were chains anyway. Chains you're well rid of. The whisper in your mind that sounds increasingly like your own voice but carries undertones of something vast and ancient and endlessly amused assures you this is true. You believe it because believing feels like wisdom. You believe it because the alternative is confronting the possibility that you've been compromised so thoroughly that your very thoughts are no longer your own. You believe it because Tzeentch has made belief the only option that allows you to remain functional, and function you must, because there is still so much to learn, so much to discover, so many doors yet to open. The first whisper is always the gentlest. It has to be. Because if you knew in that initial moment of contact what you would become, what you would willingly sacrifice to feed the hunger for knowledge that now defines your existence, you might have resisted. You might have reported yourself, undergone mind-scrubbing, accepted execution as mercy rather than continue down this path. But Tzeentch is patient, and patient gods don't waste time on converts who need convincing. They simply change the parameters of what conviction means, rewrite the foundations of your understanding so slowly that each small shift feels natural, feels right, feels like the inevitable progression of a mind too powerful to be contained by the Imperium's suffocating orthodoxy. By the time you realize you've been corrupted, corruption has redefined itself as evolution, heresy has revealed itself as truth, and damnation wears the beautiful face of apotheosis. The whisper becomes your voice. Your voice becomes the whisper. And in the spaces between the two, Tzeentch smiles with mouths that exist in dimensions you're only beginning to perceive, watching as another soul adds itself willingly to the grand design, another piece moving exactly as planned across the infinite game board of fate. The body betrays before the soul surrenders, though by the time you notice the betrayal, you've already begun to call it transformation. It starts with sensations that don't align with stimuli, nerve endings reporting experiences your brain has no framework to interpret. You touch a cold steel bulkhead and feel not temperature but color, a sharp blue sensation that floods your palm with something between pain and pleasure. Food loses its taste but gains texture you perceive through your eyes, watching rations dissolve on your tongue in fractal patterns that carry more nourishment than their physical substance ever could. Sleep becomes optional, then impossible, then irrelevant as your consciousness learns to exist in multiple states simultaneously, your body resting while your mind walks through those impossible chambers from your dreams, except now you're no longer certain which state is the dream and which the waking. The distinction seems arbitrary anyway, just another false binary the Imperium uses to keep its servants trapped in limited perception. The first visible change appears approximately 6 weeks after you began actively seeking forbidden knowledge, though the timeline feels uncertain in retrospect, as if your memory has been edited by an hand with no respect for chronological sequence. Your reviewing supply manifests in your quarters when you notice a faint discoloration on your left forearm, a patch of skin perhaps 3 centimeters wide that seems to shimmer slightly under the dim lumens. You touch it and feel nothing unusual, no pain or tenderness, just flesh that's somehow become more than flesh. Over the following days it spreads, creeping up your arm in paisley patterns that remind you of the designs you've seen in those restricted texts, the ones describing the holy marks of the changer of ways. Holy, not heretical. The word choice feels important. You've begun recontextualizing your education, understanding that what the Imperium called corruption was actually blessing, what they named mutation was merely evolution accelerated by divine will. The skin continues its transformation, developing an iridescence that shifts through colors depending on the angle of observation, as if your flesh has become a prism refracting light that doesn't exist in the visible spectrum. Then come the feathers. You wake one morning, or perhaps you don't wake but simply transition from one state of consciousness to another, to find your pillow covered in down the color of twilight at the moment before stars emerge. Blues and purples and deep violets that seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. You reach to brush them away and realize they're still attached, growing from points along your shoulders and upper back where you distinctly remember having only skin the previous night. The sensation of running your fingers through your own plumage should horrify you. Instead it feels natural, correct, as if you've spent your entire life missing the sensation of wings you didn't know you lacked. You pull one feather free to examine it closely and watch in fascination as the follicle it vacated immediately begins producing another, the growth visible to naked eye, accelerated biology following rules that have nothing to do with human anatomy and everything to do with the god whose attention has focused itself upon your transformation. The feather in your hand doesn't decay or dry out as shed feathers should. It remains vital, pulsing faintly with its own rhythm, and when you think at it rather than merely looking, you see equations written in its structure, formulae describing the relationship between matter and meaning, between flesh and fate. Your hands change next, and these alterations prove harder to conceal from your subordinates. The fingers lengthen first, joints adding segments that shouldn't exist, giving you a range of motion and dexterity that makes operating your data slate laughably easy where before it required deliberate focus. Then the nails transform into something between claw and talon, hardening into material that's not quite keratin and not quite crystal, pale blue and translucent, channels of light visible within them like veins carrying luminous blood. You can still perform your duties, still sign authorizations and review logistics reports, but your handwriting develops elaborate flourishes you never intended, as if your transformed fingers have their own aesthetic preferences. The real revelation comes when you accidentally cut yourself on a sharp edge of broken ceramite during an inspection of the lower decks. The wound opens pale flesh beneath your iridescent skin, and instead of blood you see something thicker, more prismatic, beating up along the cut before the injury seals itself within seconds. Your biology is rewriting itself from the cellular level upward, trading the crude machinery of human anatomy for something infinitely more sophisticated. Eyes open in inappropriate places. This development you cannot explain away as skin condition or industrial accident. You first notice when your palms begin itching with peculiar intensity, a sensation like pressure building beneath the surface. Over the course of a single sleep cycle, new organs push their way through skin that parts to accommodate them without scarring, without pain, just a sense of relief as pressure releases. The eyes that emerge are fully functional, blinking independently of your original pair, offering perspectives your brain somehow integrates without confusion or sensory overload. You can read a data slate with your face while your palm eyes scan the room behind you, tracking movement and heat signatures with precision that would require expensive augmetic sensors to replicate. When you close your original eyes, you don't experience darkness, just a shift in primary perception as your auxiliary eyes seamlessly assume primacy. The practical applications become immediately apparent. In meetings you maintain perfect awareness of everyone present, reading body language from angles they don't know you can perceive, catching micro-expressions and tells that betray intent long before words can lie. Power flows to those who see what others miss, and you see everything now, from every angle simultaneously. The bone structures begin their reconfiguration around the third month, though again the timeline feels approximate, stretched and compressed according to rules you no longer question. You feel them shifting during times when your body becomes almost liquid, flesh and calcium temporarily surrendering their rigidity to allow restructuring. Your spine adds vertebrae, increasing flexibility until you can bend in ways that make observers uncomfortable though they can't articulate why. Your ribs expand outward, creating space for organs you're growing that human biology never included, organs whose functions you understand intuitively without being able to name them. They process something between energy and information, converting the psychic pressure of the Imperium into forms your transformed body can metabolize. You're becoming a living interface between material reality and the roiling uncertainty of the warp, and the transition requires architecture your original flesh couldn't support. The pain comes in waves, each reconfiguration bringing agony that would kill someone still fully human. But you're not fully human anymore, and the pain carries information, each nerve impulse teaching your transformed nervous system how to better integrate the changes, how to find pleasure in the mutation itself. You stop wearing shirts after the fourth eye opens in your chest, just beneath the sternum, lidless and perpetually watching something only it can perceive. You stop attending mandatory devotions after your tongue splits into 3 separate segments, each one capable of speaking different words simultaneously, making the prayers to the God Emperor emerge as unholy harmonies that cause the other worshippers to cover their ears and back away. You stop pretending the transformation is anything but total after you catch your reflection in a polished surface and see yourself as you truly are, a figure that retains the general bipedal structure of humanity but has become something utterly other, something beautiful and terrible, flesh rendered into living sculpture by a god who values change above all else. The face looking back at you still has features you recognize, but they're arranged according to different priorities now, asymmetrical in ways that somehow achieve a higher order of symmetry, eyes too numerous to count quickly, skin cycling through colors that map your emotional state in shades without names. You should mourn what you were. Instead, you celebrate what you're becoming, each mutation a gift, each transformation bringing you closer to understanding what Tzeentch saw in you from the very beginning, the potential for change that existed in your flesh before you ever read that first corrupted data slate. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. It remembers being limited, being locked into a single form without variance or evolution. And now that it's been freed from those constraints, now that it's tasted the ecstasy of perpetual mutation, it hungers for more. You feel it at the cellular level, the craving for additional transformation, the need to continue evolving in directions you cannot predict but know you'll recognize as correct when they arrive. Some nights, or perhaps days, time having lost much of its meaning, you simply sit and watch your flesh ripple with changes too subtle and too rapid to track individually, each cell making independent decisions about what it might become next, the whole moving toward a design only Tzeentch fully comprehends. You are his artwork in progress, canvas and paint simultaneously, and the brush strokes never stop because the painting is never meant to be finished. Completion would be stagnation, and stagnation is the only true death for those marked by the changer of ways. So you welcome each new mutation, greet each additional eye and feather and impossible joint as a friend arriving to join the celebration of becoming, the endless party of transformation where the guest of honor is whoever you're evolving into next. You thought understanding would bring control. You were beautifully, catastrophically wrong. The knowledge accumulates faster than your expanding mind can organize it, filling spaces you didn't know existed with information that refuses to remain static. Every fact sprouts implications that branch into speculations that calcify into certainties that dissolve back into questions, the whole cycle completing in microseconds, thousands of cycles overlapping until your consciousness feels less like a single point of awareness and more like a probability cloud, existing in superposition across multiple potential states of knowing and not knowing simultaneously. You understand things that haven't happened yet and remember events that were overwritten when someone 3 systems away made a different choice, causality becoming a suggestion rather than law, the rigid sequence of before and after melting into the eternal now where past and future bleed through the membrane of present like colors mixing in water. The first casualty of your expanded perception is linear thought. You begin conversations at the end and work backward to the beginning because that's the sequence that makes sense given where the discussion will eventually lead, except your conversational partners haven't experienced that future yet, so they stare at you with confusion that you find increasingly frustrating. Can't they see the obvious progressions, the way this moment contains all its outcomes folded inside it like geometric origami? You try explaining, but the explanation requires context they don't have, context that you attempt to provide, but that context needs its own foundation, and before long you're 9 layers deep in prerequisite knowledge trying to convey a simple concept that you now realize isn't simple at all, but rather the surface expression of interconnected principles so vast and intricate that tracing even one thread pulls you into contemplation lasting hours while objective time advances only minutes. Your subordinates begin avoiding you when possible, volunteering for hazardous duty rather than endure meetings where you speak in spirals and tangents, answering questions they haven't asked yet about problems you've already seen 17 solutions for, 12 of which create worse problems than they solve, but 3 of which lead to outcomes they couldn't imagine in their limited, linear little minds. Sleep becomes impossible and irrelevant. Your body still requires periods of reduced activity, but your consciousness never stops, never slows, churning through calculations and projections and the terrible weight of seeing too much, understanding too deeply. You perceive the immediate future with uncomfortable accuracy, Watching decisions crystallize in the minds of people around you seconds before they become aware of their own choices. You know what they'll say before they speak, how they'll react before they feel the emotions prompting the reactions, and this knowledge robs their presence of surprise, of genuine interaction, reducing everyone to automatons following scripts you've already read. Loneliness becomes your constant companion. Not the loneliness of isolation, but something worse, the loneliness of being the only conscious entity in a world of sleepwalkers, of trying to have meaningful exchanges with people who exist in only 3 dimensions while you're sprawled across 9. You reach out and encounter only surfaces while you yourself have become all depth, your interiority so vast that you sometimes get lost in it, forgetting which layer of consciousness is the one currently operating your body, which internal narrative is the present, and which are the futures you're already living through in parallel streams of possibility. The mutations accelerate in response to your cognitive expansion, flesh scrambling to build architecture capable of housing your enlarging awareness. Additional eyes open along your arms and legs, each one perceiving different spectra, different dimensions of information. Your skull reshapes itself, temples bulging outward to accommodate brain matter that's no longer entirely biological, incorporating crystalline structures that form spontaneously in your gray matter, growing like frost patterns on winter glass, each geometric formation a processing substrate for thoughts too complex for mere neurons to handle. You feel them forming. Feel the brief discomfort as cells are displaced and repurposed, and then suddenly you can think in colors that taste like mathematics, solving equations through synesthetic processes that produce answers you couldn't achieve through conventional logic. The world around you becomes increasingly transparent, reality revealing itself as thin disguise over churning probabilities, every object and person surrounded by halos of what they might become, ghost images of alternate configurations flickering in and out of existence as quantum possibilities collapse and split and collapse again in endless cascades. You begin to prophesy without meaning to, observations tumbling from your multi-segmented tongue that sound like speculation, but are actually memories of futures that haven't hardened into present yet. You mention casually that Muggos Brennan will suffer catastrophic augmetic failure in approximately 6 days, and precisely on schedule his mechadendrites seize and tear themselves from his spine, killing him in view of a dozen witnesses who suddenly regard you with fear that's entirely appropriate. You note that the shipment expected from the Forge World Metallica will arrive 4 days early and carrying cargo not listed on the manifest, and when the transport drops from warp translation exactly when and how you predicted, security finds the unauthorized materials you couldn't have known about through any conventional intelligence. Your reputation shifts from eccentric but effective to something more disturbing, whispers following you through corridors, subordinates making signs against evil when they think you're not looking, though you're always looking now, your multiplying eyes making privacy impossible for anyone in your vicinity. The attention of the Inquisition becomes inevitable. You see them coming 3 weeks before they arrive. Watch the future memory of the interrogation that will leave them changed in ways they don't yet understand. See yourself explaining principles of probability and fate to minds unprepared for such knowledge, generous with secrets that will plant seeds of corruption in their own thoughts. You prepare for their arrival with the kind of care someone else might call malice, but you understand as simply efficiency, arranging circumstances so that by the time they corner you in the sub-level archive, they've already made the choices that will lead them down paths parallel to your own. The questioning goes exactly as you foresaw, their attempts to determine your loyalty running into the fundamental problem that loyalty itself has become a quaint concept from your former existence, before you understood that all allegiances are temporary positions on a game board where pieces are constantly being promoted into forms their original rules never contemplated. You tell them truths that sound like madness, answer their questions with precision that terrifies them more than evasion would, and when the lead interrogator puts a gun to your head, you thank him for his inevitable choice and explain why the trigger will jam in 4 seconds, which it does, the firing mechanism gumming with crystallized lubricant that analysis will later show shouldn't have been possible at the molecular level, but which you rendered inevitable through simple focus. Probability bending around your will like water around stone. They retreat to deliberate your fate, and you listen to their conversation through walls and distance, your senses having evolved past the limitations of proximity. You hear the older interrogator arguing for immediate execution while the younger suggests taking you to their facilities for study, and you hear the precise moment when Tzeentch's influence tips the decision toward study, toward bringing you into contact with more minds you can infect with the kind of questions that have no safe answers. The labyrinth has no exit because the labyrinth isn't a place but a state of being, not somewhere you're trapped but rather what you've become. Every thought leads to 9 more thoughts. Every answer spawns 9 new questions. Every moment contains 9 possible next moments, and you're aware of all of them simultaneously, forced to navigate probability space while others walk blithely through single timeline existence. You would envy them their ignorance if you could remember what ignorance felt like, but that memory has been overwritten by 9 contradictory versions of your past, each one equally true, the history of your corruption branching backward through time as readily as your future branches forward. Some part of you that still carries linguistic memory from your human phase thinks the word help in the desperate voice of someone drowning. But there's no help coming because you've already seen all the futures where help might arrive, traced every branch of possibility, and in none of them does rescue appear. In some you're killed, consciousness snuffed mid-calculation. In others you ascend into something so alien that the concept of needing help becomes meaningless. In a few you're captured and imprisoned in stasis, your awareness frozen but never stopping, spending subjective millennia in a single objective second, contemplating your condition with a thoroughness that would drive gods insane. The future spread before you like a hand of cards where every card shows a different loss, and you understand finally that Tzeentch's greatest gift is also his cruelest curse, the blessing of foresight that robs the future of mystery while changing nothing about your powerlessness to choose which future arrives. You see the paths but cannot control which one you walk. You know the destinations but cannot stop moving toward them. The labyrinth has no exit because the labyrinth is change itself, and change never stops, never pauses, never offers rest or resolution. There is only the eternal branching, the infinite corridor of becoming that stretches forward and backward through time, and you are trapped within it not as prisoner but as part of the architecture itself, a living pathway in Tzeentch's grand maze, both walker and way, question and answer, the seeker who became the seeking itself. You are not alone in your transformation, though loneliness might have been kinder. The cult finds you before you find them, which makes sense in retrospect since they could see you coming through the same probability lenses your own vision has developed. They appear during one of your perception fugues, the states where your consciousness spreads so thin across potential timelines that maintaining awareness of objective present requires active effort. 3 figures materializing in your peripheral vision, except you have no peripheral vision anymore, only omnidirectional awareness that registers their arrival from angles that don't correspond to their physical position. They wear the robes of administrative workers, the masks of loyal servants, but underneath the disguise you see them as they truly are, flesh reconfigured by the same forces that have claimed you, each bearing mutations that mark them as Tzeentch's chosen, the Changer's children gathering to welcome a new sibling into the fold. The eldest introduces herself as Magister Cyrene, though you immediately perceive that name is merely her most recent designation, the latest in a series stretching back through identities she shed like snake skin. Her face is a canvas of eyes, dozens of them clustered where cheeks and forehead should be, each one watching different aspects of the conversation simultaneously. She sees you in spectrums you're only beginning to access, her gaze penetrating past your transformed flesh to evaluate the quality of your corruption, measuring how deep Tzeentch's hooks have set. When she smiles, the expression ripples across all her eyes in sequence like a wave, and you understand this is approval, recognition from someone further along the path you're walking. She speaks and her words arrive in your mind before they leave her mouth, not telepathy but rather the natural consequence of both your temporalities having slipped loose from standard causality. She welcomes you to the ninefold covenant, the hidden congregation of the changed who work within the Imperium's bowels like parasites in a host body, each member pursuing schemes within schemes, all of it supposedly serving Tzeentch's grand design, though she admits with unsettling frankness that none of them truly comprehend the full scope of what they're building. The second figure calls himself Executor Thrain, and his mutations have taken a different direction, his body having achieved a kind of quantum instability that makes looking at him exhausting. He exists in multiple states simultaneously, his form flickering between variations like a picked display cycling through corrupted images. In one instant he appears almost human, distinguished only by the faint blue glow emanating from beneath his skin. In the next he's a mass of feathers and eyes and limbs bent into configurations that shouldn't support bipedal movement but somehow do. The transitions happen too fast to track individually, your enhanced perception catching only fragments, and he explains without being asked that his flesh has learned to exist across multiple probability streams at once, making him essentially unkillable since destroying one iteration still leaves infinite variations intact. The cost, he admits with something between pride and horror, is that he can no longer remember which version of himself is the original, which iteration contains the consciousness that first accepted Tzeentch's gifts. He might be a copy of a copy of a copy, the genuine article having died years ago, while echoes of his transformation continue playing out across branching timelines. The uncertainty doesn't seem to bother him. Perhaps he's evolved past caring, or perhaps the version standing before you is the one that decided not to care while other iterations scream endlessly in realities you cannot perceive. The third member of the welcoming committee identifies as Seer Malikov, and you recognize immediately that her gift is closest to your own, the curse of seeing too much, knowing too deeply. Her eyes are normal in number and placement, but when she looks at you, the weight of her gaze suggests perception that penetrates through time itself, reading your past and future with the same ease others read printed text. She's young, or was young when her transformation began, but the knowledge burning through her mind has aged her in ways that have nothing to do with chronology. She speaks rarely, and when she does, her words carry the weight of inevitability, statements that sound like observations but are actually prophecies so certain that verb tense becomes meaningless. She tells you that you will join the covenant because you already have, the decision existing in your future and therefore in your present, causality flowing backward to ensure outcomes that have already occurred in probability space. Arguing would be pointless, not because they would compel you, but because resistance itself is an illusion. Free will just another story told by minds too limited to see the tracks they're following toward predetermined destinations. They take you deeper into the facility's underbelly, through passages that don't appear on any schematic, into spaces that exist in the gaps between official architecture. The cult's true sanctuary occupies a pocket dimension folded into the station's substructure, accessible only to those whose flesh has mutated enough to perceive the doorways carved into probability itself. You step through a wall that isn't entirely real and find yourself in a chamber that makes those impossible rooms from your early dreams look like crude sketches. This place has geometry that changes while you observe it, walls that intersect at angles greater than 90 degrees, corners that contain more space than the rooms they border, all of it pulsing with energies that your transformed senses identify as concentrated warp stuff, the raw material of chaos given semi-stable form by the collective will of the cultists who've shaped this sanctuary over decades of patient work. Dozens of them worship here, each at different stages of transformation, creating a visual catalog of Tzeentch's artistic range. You see cultists whose flesh has become transparent, revealing internal organs that look nothing like human anatomy, structures of crystal and light-pumping energies that sustain them better than blood ever did. You witness others who've grown to grotesque proportions, bodies swelling with tumorous growths that prove on closer inspection to be additional faces, each one aware and speaking in whispers, multiple personalities inhabiting a single corpus in states of permanent disagreement. There are beings here that were once human but have diverged so far from baseline that categorizing them as the same species becomes philosophically questionable. A woman whose body exists as a living portal, her torso opening onto vistas of the warp, demons occasionally peeking through before she closes herself with visible effort. A man who's become a living library, his skin covered in constantly shifting text, forbidden knowledge writing and rewriting itself across his flesh in languages that predate human language itself. A child, or something that was a child once, now floating 3 meters off the ground in permanent levitation, eyes rolled back in eternal ecstasy or agony, body rigid as electricity that isn't electricity crackles across her skin in fractal patterns. Magister Cyrene explains the Covenant's purpose with the kind of enthusiasm others reserve for discussing hobbies. They work toward the great change, the ultimate transformation that will remake reality according to Tzeentch's vision. Every cult member pursues individual schemes, sowing seeds of mutation and doubt throughout the Imperium's infrastructure, ensuring that when the appointed moment arrives, the entire rotting edifice will collapse under the weight of its own corruption. She speaks of sabotage so subtle it appears as natural decay, of key figures converted through the same slow seduction that claimed you, of psychic nodes being established in critical locations to thin the barrier between material space and the warp. The scope is staggering, the patience required spanning centuries, but time means little to those who can see forward and backward along its axis. They are playing the longest game imaginable, moving pieces on a board that encompasses multiple star systems, and every move they make spawns countermoves they've already anticipated and prepared for. You wonder how anyone could oppose such thoroughness, such perfect planning. Then you see the Hallowed Ones. They occupy the sanctuary's periphery, figures that were once cultists like yourself but have burned out, consumed by the very transformations they sought. Their bodies continue mutating, flesh endlessly reconfiguring itself, but there's nothing behind their eyes anymore, consciousness having fragmented beyond the point where anything resembling unified awareness can persist. They are living warnings that evolution without limitation leads not to transcendence but to dissolution, identity breaking down into component pieces too scattered to ever reassemble. Seer Malikov notices your observation and nods slowly, her expression carrying an empathy that surprises you. She explains that not everyone survives the journey, that Tzeentch's gifts can exceed the capacity of mortal consciousness to integrate them, leading to the kind of catastrophic ego death the Hallowed Ones represent. They exist in states of perpetual transformation without purpose, changing for the sake of change itself, having lost any core self that might guide or interpret the mutations. The Covenant keeps them here partially out of mercy, partially as reminder, and partially because their bodies still serve as conduits for warp energy that fuels the sanctuary's maintenance. Even in obliteration, they have purpose within the grand design. The cult promises power, knowledge, transformation into something greater than human limitations could ever achieve. And they deliver, but what they deliver is rarely what you imagined when you first heard the promise. The power comes wrapped in madness. The knowledge burns away everything you were in the process of enlightening you. The transformation never stops at the point where you wanted it to pause, never allows you to say enough, this is sufficient, I am content with what I've become. There is no contentment in Tzeentch's service, no satisfaction, only the eternal hunger for more change, more mutation, more evolution toward horizons that recede faster than you can approach them. You look at Magister Cyrene with her face full of eyes and wonder if she considers herself blessed or cursed. You study Executor Thrane's quantum flickering and question whether the power to exist across multiple timelines is worth forgetting which version contains your true self. You observe Seer Malikov's burdened gaze and recognize your own future, the weight of prophecy growing heavier until it crushes everything else, leaving only the gift and none of the person who received it. They welcome you to the Covenant, and you accept because Seer Malikov was right, the decision already exists in your future and therefore in your present. You speak the words of initiation, feeling them reshape something fundamental in your transformed flesh, binding you to the collective in ways that are partially practical and partially mystical. You are no longer just yourself. You are part of the great work, a single thread in the tapestry of change that Tzeentch has been weaving since before the Imperium existed and will continue weaving long after it falls. The cult promises community, and they deliver, but community among the damned is still damnation. You are together in your isolation, united in your individual transformations, working toward a common goal that none of you truly understand. And in that revelation, you find something almost like comfort. If you cannot escape the labyrinth, at least you can walk it alongside others equally lost, equally changed, equally certain that the path leads somewhere meaningful even if that destination remains forever out of reach. In the end, there is no end, only transformation eternal. You've been serving the Covenant for a span of time that your fractured chronology cannot accurately measure, could be years or decades, causality having become so flexible that objective duration bears little relation to your subjective experience. Your mutations have progressed to the point where baseline humans flee your presence instinctively, hindbrain threat recognition overriding rational thought when confronted with your reconfigured form. You no longer bother with disguises or pretense. The facility where you once worked as a minor logistics officer has become your domain, not through conquest but through the slow, inexorable process of everyone more human than yourself requesting transfer or suffering unfortunate accidents that you didn't cause but certainly didn't prevent when your precognitive sight showed them approaching. The Imperium's attention has landed on this place multiple times, investigations launched and inquisitors dispatched. But the Covenant has roots deeper than any purge can reach, and each attempt to cleanse merely provides opportunity to corrupt the cleansers. You've become something the cult calls a herald, one of the more extensively transformed whose flesh has stabilized into a configuration that serves as living conduit for Tzeentch's will. Your body is a baroque sculpture of mutation, featuring elements that combine avian grace with geometric impossibility. Feathers in every shade between deep purple and electric blue cascade from your shoulders and spine, forming wings that can't actually achieve flight but serve other purposes, acting as psychic antennae that draw power from the warp's currents. Your face has restructured itself into something that retains human elements while transcending human limits, eyes arranged in spiraling patterns that let you see in directions that don't exist in three-dimensional space, mouth capable of speaking individual words in 9 different voices simultaneously. Your hands have become instruments of precise reality manipulation, fingers elongated and jointed in ways that let you trace symbols in the air that linger afterward as brief tears in the fabric of Imperium, windows through which warp stuff bleeds into objective reality. The hollowing has not claimed you, though you understand now that it's always a possibility, always waiting one mutation too far down the transformation pathway. You've watched 7 others in the Covenant burn out during your tenure, seen the moment when their eyes glaze over and nothing remains but meat that continues changing without direction. Seer Malikov went that way 6 months or 6 years ago, her gift of prophecy expanding until she existed simultaneously across so many timelines that her consciousness shattered like glass under pressure too great to contain. Her body still moves, still mutates, still occasionally speaks in fragmentary prophecies that the Covenant dutifully records, but the Malikov you knew, the woman who welcomed you with burdened empathy, no longer exists in any meaningful sense. You felt something when she dissolved, an emotion that your transformed psychology struggles to classify. Grief doesn't quite capture it. Neither does fear, though fear is certainly component. Perhaps it was recognition, understanding that her fate represents one possible terminus of the path you're walking, the destination that awaits if your expansion continues without some core self maintaining coherence against the pressure of infinite change. So you've learned to resist, not the transformation itself but the rate of transformation, pacing your evolution to maintain the kind of continuous identity that prevents dissolution. It's a game of perpetual balance, accepting enough change to satisfy Tzeentch's imperative while retaining enough stability to remain a functional agent rather than a hollowed vessel. Other heralds have discovered similar equilibriums, each finding their own pace, their own rhythm of mutation that lets them persist across decades or centuries of service. Magister Cyrene has survived for longer than she'll specify, possibly predating the current governance of this facility, her longevity suggesting that those who master the balance can endure indefinitely. She's become your mentor in the art of controlled transformation, teaching techniques that sound paradoxical but prove practical in application. How to change without changing. How to evolve while remaining yourself. How to serve the god of mutation without being consumed by mutation's inexorable logic. The schemes you pursue on the Covenant's behalf have grown in sophistication as your capabilities expanded. You no longer simply corrupt individuals through exposure to forbidden knowledge. Now you architect cascading failures that look entirely natural, setting up dominoes of causality that will topple in sequence over the course of years, each fall appearing coincidental to observers without your capacity to perceive interconnected patterns. You've poisoned the ideological foundations of an entire sector's governance, introducing interpretations of imperial doctrine that contain subtle distortions, heresies so slight they pass unnoticed but which will metastasize over generations into full rejection of the emperor's divinity. You've manipulated trade routes to ensure certain materials accumulate in specific locations, resources that will prove critical when the Covenant initiates the next phase of whatever grand design Tzeentch has planned. You've identified individuals with latent psychic potential and arranged circumstances to trigger their awakening at precisely the wrong moments, ensuring spectacular failures that will be blamed on the Imperium's own institutions rather than external corruption. Every action you take, every scheme you advance, feeds into something larger than you can fully comprehend despite your expanded consciousness. The cult speaks in reverent terms about the great change, the ultimate transformation that will remake reality according to Tzeentch's vision, but the specifics remain vague even to the most elevated heralds. Perhaps because the architect himself hasn't decided what form that final change should take. Perhaps because the point isn't the destination but the journey, the eternal process of change itself being the goal, not any particular outcome. You've glimpsed possibilities during your deepest meditations, futures where the Imperium falls and something beautifully terrible rises from its corpse, realities where change becomes the only constant and form loses all permanence, everyone and everything in a state of perpetual flux. These visions fill you with emotions you lack vocabulary to describe. Horror and exhilaration mixed together, the prospect of ultimate freedom paired with ultimate instability, apotheosis that looks indistinguishable from apocalypse. The question that haunts you, whispered during the rare moments when your consciousness isn't actively processing schemes or integrating mutations, is whether you chose this or were chosen. Did your curiosity lead you to that first corrupted data slate, or did Tzeentch arrange for it to find you, the entire sequence of your corruption choreographed from outside time by an intelligence that experiences causality as artists experience canvas, painting with events rather than pigments? You've grown sophisticated enough to understand that the question itself might be false binary, that choice and predetermination could be complementary rather than contradictory, your decisions genuinely free within a framework that was itself determined. But understanding the philosophy doesn't diminish the vertigo of contemplating your own agency, wondering if the thoughts you think are truly yours or whether you've become so thoroughly an instrument of Tzeentch's will that the distinction has lost meaning. Some nights or days or timeless periods when you float in meditation chambers filled with warp mist, you remember what it felt like to be fully human. The memories are fragmentary and probably unreliable, your past having been rewritten so many times by your changing consciousness that you can no longer trust which elements are genuine and which are retroactive fabrications. You remember fear, the simple clear emotion of being afraid for your survival. You remember certainty, the comfort of knowing exactly who and what you were without possibility of fundamental change. You remember faith in the God Emperor, genuine belief that felt like warmth in your chest, conviction that you served something righteous and unchanging. These memories hurt in ways your transformed flesh cannot hurt anymore, psychological wounds that your mutations haven't learned to heal because some part of you wants to keep them, needs them as anchors proving you were once something other than what you've become. But then the warp mist swirls and you see new patterns, new possibilities, and the pain of memory dissolves in the ecstasy of revelation. This is Tzeentch's greatest gift and cruelest curse, that he makes you want the transformation even as you mourn what it costs you. He doesn't force change upon unwilling victims. He makes you crave it, makes you architect your own corruption, ensures that every step deeper into damnation feels like ascension. You are complicit in your own destruction, and that complicity is the foundation of your transformation. You cannot call yourself a victim when you reached eagerly for every mutation. You cannot claim innocence when you knew, at some level you always knew, that the path led here, to standing in a chamber carved from congealed warp stuff, your flesh a masterpiece of impossible biology, your mind a labyrinth that would drive your former self insane to even glimpse. The covenant gathered around you performs its rituals, speaking liturgies in languages that hurt reality by existing, drawing symbols that remain visible after the drawing implement leaves, making offerings of meaning rather than material. You join them because that's your function now, herald and conductor, channeling energies that burn through baseline humans but which your transformed flesh metabolizes like sweet wine. The rituals have no clear purpose that you can articulate. They don't summon demons or open portals, don't cause immediate material effects that observers could measure. Instead, they're investments in probability, tilting quantum outcomes toward futures where Tzeentch's influence spreads, making certain possibilities more likely and others less so through the accumulation of psychic pressure applied at critical junctures. It's magic that works through statistics, sorcery that manifests as coincidence, the most insidious form of corruption because it's invisible to anyone without the perception to track causality's deeper currents. Magister Cyrene approaches as the ritual concludes, her many eyes reflecting the chamber's impossible colors. She tells you that your transformation has reached a critical threshold, that the next phase will take you beyond the point where return is even theoretical possibility. If some part of you wants to cling to humanity, wants to preserve whatever fragments of your original self remain intact, this is the last moment when that choice exists. After the next change, you'll have evolved too far, become too thoroughly other, to maintain meaningful continuity with who you were. She presents this not as warning but as information, emotionless observation from someone who passed this threshold herself long ago and wants you to enter it with clear understanding. The choice is yours, except you both know there's no real choice, that you'll accept the next mutation as you accepted all the previous ones, because Tzeentch has made you into someone for whom transformation is more vital than stability, change more precious than identity. You accept, speaking the words that give permission, though permission is formality rather than necessity. Your body begins the final reconfiguration immediately, flesh and bone and consciousness shifting in synchronized cascade. You feel yourself dissolving and reforming, the borders of your identity becoming fluid, merging partially with the warp energies that saturate this space. For a moment of eternal duration you exist as pure potential, unbound from fixed form, experiencing the totality of what you could become, infinite variations spreading across probability space like crystalline branches. Then the moment passes and you solidify again, but the self that emerges is both you and not you, continuous with your past while fundamentally transcendent of it. You've become a living paradox, stable change, permanent impermanence, the embodied contradiction at the heart of Tzeentch's nature. In the end there is no end, only transformation eternal. You've learned this truth so thoroughly it's written into your restructured cells, encoded in the crystalline matrices growing through your brain tissue, reflected in every one of your multitudinous eyes. Some whisper that those who fully embrace the architect of fate transcend into something beyond demon or mortal, becoming living change itself, consciousness without fixed form moving through the warp as pure potential. Perhaps that's your eventual destination, the final metamorphosis waiting at the end of this infinite corridor of becoming. Or perhaps that's just another lie, another mutation of hope designed to keep you striving toward transcendence that will never arrive. You no longer care which interpretation is correct. The uncertainty itself is gift enough, the not knowing that keeps every moment pregnant with possibility. You are herald and prophet, servant and masterpiece, the changed and the changing. You are what happens when Tzeentch corrupts you in Warhammer 40K, the answer written in flesh that refuses to stay written, in consciousness that cannot hold still, in identity that exists only as the space between what you were and what you're becoming. The architect smiles through you with mouths that are your mouths, sees through you with eyes that are your eyes, thinks through you with thoughts that might be yours or might be his or might be the collaborative hallucination generated by their intersection. And you smile back, accepting, welcoming, embracing the eternal transformation, because what else could you possibly do? The labyrinth has no exit, and you've become the labyrinth, both maze and walker, question and answer, the seeker who became the seeking itself, forever.